Let's get started with our session for this evening. I'm Lina Rivera. I'm a research and extension associate in organic agriculture. Our next speaker is Dr. Jess Jerusha Lay from University of Kentucky, and she's going to talk about small ruminant production.
Well, good afternoon. So most of you guys know me as Jessie. Tell you what, I'm getting a little sentimental coming back. I was at Kentucky State for about 7 years, and I just recently, a couple months ago, shifted over to UK. So feels like home coming back. So how many people have small ruminants? Okay. Well, so this is going to be about sheep and goats today. All right, so how long have you had them? Yeah. All right, so I've got this very basic presentation today, right? I'm going to start going over, but for those of you guys who've heard me talk before, I get off subject, so if you got a question and there's something more you want to know about, just ask. Like I said, we can skip around and I'll make it work. Right. So when we start talking about small ruminant production, we raise small ruminants for multiple purposes. When we start talking about sheep, right, I love lamb meat. If you've never had lamb and chili, that is the best chili in the world, right? But we also raise them for wool, of which right now the wool market's not that great, right? And now there's actually milk sheep. Has anybody heard of the new dairy sheep? Has anybody heard of black lion? Yeah, so it's actually one of the newest and upcoming things. They are making vodka out of sheep's milk, which just sounds nasty to me, but yeah, it is. So dairy sheep are now becoming very popular. I was at a meeting with some legislators the other day because we don't have any regulations on sheep's milk, right? So kind of getting behind the industry. But there's always trends of the direction the industry's going. Now, goat's milk's been around for a long time. We make lotions out of it, soaps, and it's one of the most digestible milks. A lot of people that can't handle cow's milk do just fine with goat's milk. Also, goats for weed control, or at the end of the day, just the enjoyment of it, right? There's nothing like farming just to make you feel grounded. I'm not gonna get a laugh out of y'all, am I? All right, it's fine. All right, where'd I put mine? Yeah, so that's my little girl. So facility requirements. This is always, the first question. I want to get some goats. What am I going to need? All right, so goats aren't just small cattle, right? And sheep aren't goats. There are differences. So a lot of people with cattle backgrounds, when they're like, oh, I think I'm gonna get some goats. I've heard there's money in that, right? We got to sit down and have a heart-to-heart first, right? So facilities. Now it's true, especially for farmers with small acreages, that you can put more animals per acre. They're smaller, right? Cattle, we usually say one cow per acre. Now, sheep and goats, we can put about 4 lambs or 4 ewes per acre. Right? So it's like perfect for people with small operations. Right? But there's some trade-offs. Right? Cattle walking around this winter with a leather jacket on, literally. Right? Sheep and goats, they don't have that. Some of them have a wool jacket. It's not as warm as leather. Right? But they need to have some shelters, right? Cows just fine out there in the snow. Our sheep and goats, we're going to have to do something to help them out here. So a shelter is a must. When it comes to lambing and kidding, much more labor intensive. We need to bring them in the barn, get them somewhere warm. They're going to be much more sensitive to the cold. right? We've got to have a place to separate them. So when you're like, well, if I got 10 acres, I can go get 40. Well, hold on. You're going to have the boys over in this pen, a special pen for them. Then you're going to have the yearlings that aren't big enough to be bred. So really, you can't do all of your acreage because you're going to have to split them up, right? And then you're going to have some guard animals, right? Everybody loves lamb, right? Even the coyotes, right? Shelter. Now, when I say, I'm just a good old country girl, right? Grew up on a small farm, and when you've got a small operation, the biggest and best of everything is just not practical. You wouldn't believe how many people come to me and they're like, well, I want to get like 10 sheep, right? If you got 10 sheep, it does not make sense to go buy a $40,000 tractor, $80,000, right? But you can feed square bales instead of round bales. So making practical decisions based on what your operation is. And this goes back to your original goals. What are you trying to do? Right? So I've seen them made from the one in the top, a pretty cheap method, some of the prefab sheds. You don't have to get fancy, just enough, something to knock off the wind and the rain. But compared to cattle, we do have to have some kind of shelter for these guys. Right? Water, feeding troughs, right? We're going to have to be much, much more cognizant about keeping their water and their feed clean and dry, right? Handling facilities, right? So handling facilities actually gets much easier. In the big cows, you got to have a working chute and a head catch. No, goats were born with handlebars. You grab them by the horn, you can just do what you need to do, right? Sheep, anybody ever tripped a sheep? Know what I'm talking about? Yeah, a sheep, you trip it, set it up on its butt, and it's stuck. It can't move anywhere, right? Makes them super easy. So we're not going to have the fancy handling systems that we do with cattle. All right, keep on rolling here. I know. Yeah, they just sit down. They just give up. So waters, and if you got goats, anybody Meta back there, right? You got goats, I swear, they poop on their water on purpose. They poop in their water, and then they won't drink it. Am I wrong? Right? So you got to keep the waters clean. So I don't know. I promise. I know they're doing it on purpose, right? So there's going to be more labor. We've got to watch the water because they are by nature a lot more finicky than that old cow out in the field. Grain, right? So they are super sensitive to parasites, which you get from fecal material. So keeping all the feces out of the troughs. So then you start looking at hay feeders. I've actually got a project right now that I'm working on. That hay feeder at the top, I hate that thing. I hate it. Can anybody tell me why I hate it? Yes. So that triangle part is open-ended, and you get little babies that climb in there, and their legs just snap. Right? If I had $1 for every lamb that's broke its leg in a feeder like that. So I'm actually working with one of the equipment companies. We're making some new designs. So try to get some things that are going to be a little bit more friendly. But you can also always make your own feeders. Right? So right here, minerals, super, super important in these guys. So this is probably one of the best mineral feeders I've seen. It's probably about $30 worth PVC pipe at Lowe's. Right? You can put it together yourself. And what you do is you pour the mineral in the top, and it makes a self-feeder. The small opening keeps them from climbing in it and pooping in it, which they do on purpose. Right? So now here's one of those things where I talk about sheep and goats are not the same thing. Right? So goats have to have copper. Right? It's one of the big things that will reflect your fertility rates. Right? It will affect growth rates, Goats have got to have copper in their mineral. Sheep, copper is toxic to them. It takes very, very little copper to kill a sheep. So let me ask you this. What do you do when you go to a feed store and there's a bag that says sheep and goat mineral? For the love of God, throw it away. If you can feed it to both of them, it's not good for either one of them, right? Because if one got to have it, one of them can't have them have it. No, ain't the same thing. Can't do it. Always feed something that's going to be species specific, because somebody much smarter than me has calculated down to the milligram of how much of this they require and made it match, right? I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not the one that's going to come to your house and help just create a feed from scratch, but I know people, and they balance it from the exact amount of protein to the amount of fat to every little mineral has been calculated to be specific for that species. Selenium is a big one. So selenium is super, super important for our immune system and our muscles. So Kentucky is so selenium deficient, our soil lacks that mineral to the point the feed companies are legally not even allowed to add enough to compensate, right? At lambing, I always give a selenium injection just because I know these things are going to come out borderline deficient, right? For those of you who've got lambs, you ever had a lamb and you couldn't get it to nurse when it was born? It's like its tongue was just flopping around. You ever had that happen? Right? That is one of the first signs of a selenium deficiency, and it's because they can't get their muscles, the muscles in those tongue, to work properly. Yes, right. And you'll know because it's just born and you're like, is it cold? What's going on with it? You'll try to give it a bottle and its tongue is just flapping to the side and like they can't control it. But the tongue is a muscle. Right? And when they're born, they need that selenium for their muscles to function. All right. So guard animals, like I said, coyotes, neighbors' dogs, and everyone worries about coyotes, and it is a concern. But you'll have a lot of problems with neighbors' dogs. Because coyotes, they will come and kill something. They'll drag it off and they'll spend about a week eating it. Then they'll come back and get another one. Some of the most horrific things I've ever seen is when the neighbors' dogs get in there and they're just killing for fun. They're not hungry. They just think it's something fun to chase. And, I've walked into farms and, just seen 30 animals laying there mangled, right? So you've got to have a guard animal. Now, this can come in a lot of different forms, right? So dogs are the most common. I don't have a favorite breed. That's an Anatolian, Great Pyrenees work, and lots of other different crosses. Make sure that you do flea and tick prevention. They're going to need their vaccines. They're not free, but they're your security guard, right, to protect and serve. That's what he's doing. So make sure that you're taking care of your guard animals as well. So donkeys work great, right? Someone said, well, what kind of donkey do I get? I said, a mean one, right? But donkeys, they're just very territorial, right? So you want to get one that's been around sheep and goats before, because you want them to accept when these new babies hit the ground and they're sitting there screaming. You don't want a donkey that's going to go after them. So make sure it's been raised with sheep and goats. But a strange dog comes in that field, a donkey will stomp it to death. A mule? Yes, mules. Oh. Yeah, but they are. It's a territorial. Now, if you get one that, and get them used to the sheep and goats, they do well. When a dog comes in that pasture, they don't like it. Same thing with alpacas and llamas. But I'm not going to lie to you. So with an alpaca, right, where are they descended from? right? It's cold temperatures up in the top of the mountains. So if they're not shaved, they can have a heat stroke at 85 degrees and enough humidity. There's also something called the meningeal worm that they get from white-tailed deer. And who's got a farm that's never had a white-tailed deer on it? They got no business being in Kentucky. Like, yeah, they are. They're cute, they're beautiful. I'm with you there, but you're going to have some issues and some maintenance of making sure that they're not going to get heat stress and Ivomec to prevent the meningeal worm. So fencing, all right. This is another, right, difference between sheep and goats here. Right? Who's got sheep? Right, sheep. And then who's got goats? They got the better fences, guaranteed, right? Because goats can get out of about anything. They're masters. Don't know how they do it, right? Your perimeter fencing around the outside. You know, if they get through a fence internally, we can go out there and we can move them. It is a pain, but making sure that perimeter fence around the outside, that's going to have to be a super strong fence. So, you know, I got cows at home. I'm not gonna lie, limb fell on my electric fence last week. Cows have been on the honor system, and they ain't gone anywhere. With a goat, that's not gonna happen. Right? Making sure that even if you've got electric fences, that it's got current on it, because they will test it. Also, right, so everybody's seen the woven wire fence. The standard woven wire fence, the squares are 4 by 6, kind of rectangles. We don't want those with goats, right? What happens? They get their head stuck in there, right? Because those horns will collapse when they go in, and then when they come out, it's like a fish hook. And they're going to be stuck in that fence every other day. And you'd think after they got stuck, they wouldn't do it again. No, they keep doing it. So if you have problems with that, go get like a stick and duct tape it to their horns so they can't get through. But it's much better preferred if you'll have the 4 by 4 squares in your fence. It will prevent you from having a lot of headaches. Yeah, or the goat's headaches. The woven wire. So the outside typical standard woven wire that most people get for cattle, the squares in it are like 4 by 6 inches, which kind of make a rectangle. And those work great for cattle, but you can get a fence that's 4 by 4, and they're not going to be able to get their head through the smaller square. Okay. All right, so purchasing your livestock, right? So you want to buy from a reliable source, right? We're not just going to the yards and buying anything, because there's a lot of contagious diseases, right? What's the old saying? Figures don't lie, but a lot of liars figure, right? So you want to get an accurate history, get them from somebody you trust, someone that you know is vaccinating, because you don't want to be bringing in problems. A lot of these contagious diseases, once you get them on your farm, it is really, really difficult to get rid of them, right? So you're going to isolate them. When you bring them in, put them in a pen by themselves for at least 2 weeks, and then check their feet. I'm going to get to foot rot here in just a minute, but that's super, super important. Right? Everyone's always worried about parasites when they come in, but the first thing I look at is their feet. Right? And ask the history. Right? There's nothing wrong with asking somebody when you go buy something from them, have you ever had CLs? Right? Have you ever had problems with this? When was the last time they got vaccinated? Because you start asking those questions, right, you're going to learn a lot about the history. Right? So nutrition, like I said, I am not a nutritionist, but right, the immune system. Right now, I'm a vet, so I'm always worried about diseases. Nutrition is the single most important thing you can do to take care of these guys. Right? My professor in vet school, Dr. Carson, I love the man. One of the smartest people. You look at him and like, he always had a big chew in, looked like Elmer Fudd, I swear. But the man was brilliant, right? And he, number one day of class, he said, sex is a luxury, right? The body will take care of what it needs before it takes care of what it wants, right? So what that means is if they're not getting enough protein, if they're not getting enough minerals, the body's got to have calories for the heart to keep beating, for the lungs to expand, to be able to walk. But reproduction will be the very first thing that's compromised if you have any kind of nutritional. And like I said, we've got to remember the minerals too. I've seen plenty of goats that were fat and sassy, right? And they couldn't get them bred. And they're like, well, they're not thin, Doc. But they weren't getting the mineral. Because you can have an animal that looks great, but if it's not getting enough mineral, the same thing. It's always going to be reproduction that suffers first. Right. So also, browsers versus grazers. Does anybody know what I'm talking about when I say that? This is another thing where you're between species to species, things are different. A cow, I mean, she's like a lawnmower. She puts that nose on the ground. She don't care what she eats. She's just going. Anybody heard of hardware disease? Like cows will swallow little pieces of metal because they don't care what they're eating. Sheep and goats aren't like that. And actually, goats, as their evolution has developed, they like eating shrubs. This is why we use them to clear brush. It's because if you give a goat the choice of eating grass, beautiful grass, or a bush, they want the bush. They want to eat off that bush. You know, and there's even plants that we've known for years are toxic to cattle, right? Cows, this plant will kill a cow. Goats seem to be able to eat a lot of those and not have any problems. So even on the specialist level, we're still learning stuff ourselves. All right. So breeding, here's another difference. So if you've been into cattle and you switch to sheep and goats, right, you're going to have some differences. They're seasonal breeders, right? So Mother Nature's smarter than we will ever be. Like, I'm just going to tell you that. We can try to do a lot of things, but Mother Nature, she's already figured it out for us. When do we have the most grass in Kentucky? April, May, somewhere in there in spring. So these guys are seasonal breeders. Mother Nature said, okay, we got the most grass, right? We got the most resources in the spring. She's only going to be pregnant for about 5 months. So Mother Nature already figured this out, and she's going to start coming into heat when the days get short. When the length of day, it starts getting dark at 5 o'clock, that's when she wants to come into heat. Mother Nature's done this by design. Right? What about horses? Horses are pregnant like 11 months, 12 months for donkeys. But Mother Nature still wanted them to have babies in the spring, so they're opposite. They're coming into heat in the spring because, like I said, Mother Nature's already done this for us. Now, can you get them to breed out of season? Yes, but you're going to have lower fertility rates, right? And it has to do with that seasonal effect. They're pregnant for 5 months, right? Much shorter than our cattle. But the big thing is the multiple effect. So cows give you 1 baby a year. Right? The perfect sheep or goat should average 2.25. Right? That's your sweet spot. That's where you're making the most money. Right? You want them to have multiples. Okay, got ahead of myself, right? I always laugh when I pull this slide up. That was a set of triplets. When I say 2.25, kind of what it looks like. Right? Which also means you need to keep records. Because if you have a doe or a ewe that's having singles every year, y'all are losing money on her. And how do you know that if you're not keeping records? All right, hang on, I'll get off my soapbox. Right, but we're always expecting multiples. Like if she's had a baby and still pushing, I'm going in looking for another one, right? Always. And you're like, well, there's 3 of them laying there. Well, there could be 4. There could be 5. Now, 6 isn't very common, right? 6, we start getting into a litter. But, right, quads and even quintuplets are really common. I went to one client's house, and we're sitting there, and I go in, and she's got towels, and she's all, trying to get it dried off because it's colder. I'll get out that day. And she's like, and I just keep throwing lambs over my shoulder, and she's like, would you stop it? Right? Always expect another one. All right. So I'm going to skip over the signs of, we can go over that later, but I think we'll run out of time. Stages of labor. Always expect another one. If she's still pushing, she ain't done, right? When you get the babies out, right? We're always worried. We got that towel trying to get them dried off, but don't forget about your ewe or your doe, right? You want a FAMACHA, check her for parasites, the eyelid, right? Make sure the udder doesn't have any signs of mastitis, and make sure that the kids are up nursing, right? You might see them, and they look like they're nursing, but is anything coming out? Are they getting anything? Because we talked about how that suckle reflex could be weak. Right? So bottle babies, if I ever get to heaven, one of my questions is for God. Cows, they have 1 baby at a time, and they got 4 spigots. Then he designs sheep and goats to have triplets and quads and only gives them 2 spigots. I don't understand this. Like I said, I ever make it to the pearly gates, that's going to be my first question. Right? So when they do have these multiples, right, if you get quads, so that little tiny one I showed a picture of a minute ago, you're going to have some bottle babies, right? Because, you're like, oh, she's going to have 4 lambs a year. That's awesome. Look, she's having 4 a year. No, because you're bottle feeding 2 of them, and that's going to get old quick, right? So some will have enough milk to feed triplets, but you're really going to have to watch them. But one of the natures of the beast is when they're having multiples, is you're going to have bottle babies occasionally, right? Colostrum is key. They have got to get colostrum within the first 12 hours. Any of our livestock that don't get colostrum within the first 12 hours, it's a death sentence, right? So that's why when you go out there and you see her in the jug, make sure that lamb is getting something. Because if you say, well, I'll check it on it in the morning it's too late. At that point, they can no longer absorb it. All right. Oh, those are just some numbers on them. Yeah. Yeah. Not sure what that system was. But once again, that's a homemade. I'm all up for homemade designs. Y'all get some feeders, start making some stuff. Let me know, because I'm always a do-it-yourselfer. Right? I'm cheap. I just don't want to pay for stuff. Right? Vaccines are a whole lot easier. So there's only one real vaccine that you got to give sheep and goats, but you've got to give it, right? And that's the CD and T. So it's Clostridiums type C and D and tetanus. Real easy, name for what it is. So when they're babies, you're going to give their first vaccine when they're about 6 to 8 weeks old on average. And then you're going to come back a month later and give them another booster, right? You got to give them that booster. After that, the shots are just once a year. All right. So castration, this is also different from cows, right? So in cattle, most of the time we open cut them. Right? Sheep and goats, right? They hit maturity much, much younger, right? The best method for castrating sheep and goats is going to be banding. Right? In cattle, I hate banding, but that is the preferred method. If you wait till they're over 4 months old, you're going to have to take them to a vet It's probably going to be a surgical deal with sedation and anesthesia. So before they're 5, 6 months old, banding is the preferred method. But banding also runs in risk of tetanus. So make sure they've had those vaccines before we castrate them. All right, so just a couple more things I'm going to hit because I'm about out of time. All right, so sheep and goats, right? Homuncus is going to be the #1 parasite we worry about. Right? There's lots of them. I've got some classes on this if you want or you're interested into some of my parasitology workshops. Let me know afterwards, and I'll email you next time I have one. Right? So homuncus is the barber pole worm. Right? So you see up there at the top, that red and white swirl? What these guys do is they're blood-sucking demons, literally. So these worms bite into the lining of the stomach, and they suck blood. So when you zoom in on a picture, that red swirl is actually the digestive system. When you see that red swirl, that's from the blood that this thing has drank. Well, one little worm probably doesn't cause that much damage. But look at this other picture. When you get thousands of them, they literally are, the animal's bleeding to death internally, and you can't see it. Right? So we're going to have to do some things, and especially with goats. Everyone says, parasites kill goats. Well, where they're used to eating on shrubs, they don't eat on the ground. They have no natural resistance. Right? So you get parasites from the fecal-oral route. Those adults are in the stomach, drinking blood. They lay eggs. Eggs come out through the poop. Right? They don't go to the restroom. They don't wash their hands. Right? Sheep and goats, cattle, they just poop while they're walking. Right? Which is the same place they're eating. These things, they're literally pooping on their dinner plate. Right? And that's what perpetuates the parasites. Right? So just think about this common sense. More animals on one spot, the more poop on one spot and the less grass. So use appropriate stocking rates. If you get them overcrowded, you're going to create more problems with parasites. Rotational grazing. Right? Have them on one field. Once they start getting parasites on that grass, right, pick them up and move them to a different pasture. So see that bottom picture? Isn't that pretty? No, that's not. So what that is one drop of dew. It's one water droplet. And all those tiny little swirls are larvae or potential parasites, right? So the baby version of worms. So if a goat gets that one water droplet, that's how many worms she just consumed that will infect her. So it's super important for pasture management. All right. So the Fomantia, right? This is a really quick, easy way we can tell if they've got problems with the barber pole worm. And they have a scale. They have a scale from 1 to 5 where you judge how anemic she is. Right? But if you know the difference between red, pink, and white, you're pretty good. But what this is when she's losing blood from these internal parasites, what's going to happen? She's going to get pale. Right? When you start losing blood, you start getting pale. Right? How do you tell if a red goat's pale? Right? They've got hair. Their skin's thicker. Right? So what we're going to do is we're going to pull down that eyelid and look at those mucous membranes, and that's going to be a more accurate way to tell if she's losing blood through parasites. So deworming, that's, in the old days, we knew that goats had problems with parasites, right? So we're like, all right, we're just going to deworm them every 3 months. We'll fix that. No, that was bad. It was not a good decision. Because what happened is when we kept deworming animals that didn't need it, those worms were getting used to the drug. And now half of our dewormers aren't working anymore, and we've boxed ourselves in a corner. So the best way to prevent resistance to the dewormers is going to be only worm them when you need them. Now weaning is the one exception. When we wean them, we're going to go ahead and deworm everything because we know those little baby angels are stressed during that time, right? But otherwise, we're going to watch the Fumancha score, and we're only going to give drugs to the animals that need it. Which, think about this too. I mean, as a consumer, right? You don't want to buy meat when someone's just been throwing chemicals at them. Right? So, this is something we're going to be strategic about what we're doing. Right? I don't want you to forget about coccidia. So coccidia is another big parasite of sheep and goats, especially young animals. It is a protozoa. Blah, blah, blah differences, but it's a single-celled organism, kind of like a bacteria with some technical differences. But the most common thing, I always get these phone calls, and they're like, hey, doc, this thing's got diarrhea, and I've dewormed it 3 times now. That's not a worm, right? So it's not going to get killed by dewormers. Right? This is something doing a fecal exam is going to help you detect. All young animals need to be on a coccidiostat, right? That's something that they put in their feed. And it's in the feed because that's toxic to horses. So if you're feeding young animals, the label should say, do not feed to horses, right? So that's one way, but on young animals, you've always got to have that. If your barns, if your kidding pens have problems with sanitation, you're going to see a ton of problems with this. When I start seeing farms that have lots of cases of coccidia, the first thing I ask them is how often they're cleaning their kidding pens and cleaning their barn. All right, so there are some other causes of scours. I think I'm about out of time. Just a few more minutes left, so I'm going to skip over this for now. So I want to mention a few other diseases, though. So when you see this lamb come in, and you're like, what have you got on your mouth? Because, it's one of your babies. You pick it up and you start scratching at it. Is that a scab? What is that? No, that's a virus, right? So that's ORF, right? Contagious, right, to people as well. So if you see that on their lips, do not touch it. You will also occasionally see sores on the udder or around the vulva, right? But that is just a virus like chickenpox. It's got to run its course. It's kind of in the same category. In humans, it'll cause big sores on your hands, but it usually takes about a month to go. You do, if you can. Sometimes it's too late by the time you see it, but if you do see it, get it away from the other animals, and remember to clean that feeder before you take it somewhere else, because the feeders, once they start rubbing, because it itches, so they'll start rubbing it on stuff, but that is contagious, so you start seeing that, pull them out. It will go away on its own, but it takes several weeks. All right, so when we start talking about yearlings and adults, parasites, the young animals and stressed animals are when parasites are always going to be the biggest problem, right? We'll skip to diseases of the hoof real quick. All right, so what happens when we graze? We take a bite, we take a step. We take a bite, we take a step. That's what grazing is. Right? These animals got to be able to walk to eat. Right? So, a lawnmower up there with a flat tire, how much grass is it cutting? It's not. And I always put that picture in because people don't understand. They're like, well, they're just limping on that one leg. They're not limping real bad. Well, if they can't walk around, they're not eating. These animals, if you get something wrong with that foot, it'll seem like they lose like 60 pounds overnight. They do. They will suddenly drop off because you can't just throw them out there in the pasture if they're not getting around. So there's a lot of things that affect the hoof. So nutrition is a big one, right? Breed and genetics. Okay. Right. So, but foot rot, this is something different in cows. So cows, when they get foot rot, right, it's not contagious. It's usually wet time of the year, right? Cow's foot rot is actually what we call foot scald. So there's a difference in sheep and goats. And if you're getting sheep and goats, you've got to know this, and this is something to watch for. All right, so foot scald, Fusobacterium nephrorum. Right? So this is a bacteria that's in all the soils. It's there. Wintertime, when they're standing around a lot of water, right, they get a piece of gravel in between their toes. It's going to cause just irritation between the toes. And that's just benign foot scald. It's from them standing in water and getting something irritated. That's not a big problem. That's going to happen. They're not pets. They're not in the house. So that's okay. But you'll see in the picture up at the top that that's just irritation and kind of raw between the toes. But the problem is that bacteria can set them up for contagious foot rot. Now this bacteria is a bad dude. Right? This is the one you do not want brought in on your farm. This bacteria actually will liquefy the tissues in that sole. See on this side how that hard tissue of the sole, that hoof wall, has just been eaten through? This is super, super contagious. It is so hard to get off your farm once you get it that I know a lot of producers. I know a guy, he had like 200 sheep, and he got this on his farm. He tried to treat it. He ended up just selling all 200 of them. Start waiting a few weeks and starting over because he couldn't get rid of it. Right? So always check their feet. When you bring them in, if you see any deformities in that hoof, right, you want to be suspect because sometimes if you treat them, they can become chronic carriers of it. So this is something to always be watching for. All right. You can give them antibiotics and treat it. You can run the whole herd through foot baths, right? Because 10 to 14 days of the pasture being clean, right? You can move those animals every 10 to 15 days, run them all through these, but that's very labor intensive. So the best thing is just not to get it on your farm to start with. All right, I think I'm going to stop there. All right, any questions? Yes. For sheep or goats? Okay, so when we're talking about good pasture, we talk about 1 or about 4 per acre, if that's good quality pasture. Now, when you get into forest, right, you're not going to have that lush grass. They still, like I said, goats prefer the brush anyway, but I don't know that there's a measurement. How dense is the brush in that forest? You know, that varies. Some forests don't have any shrubs at all, and some of them will have honeysuckle everywhere. So it kind of depends on, when you say forest, is it just leaves on the ground, or is there some shrubbery there as well? Right. It's probably going to be more like 2 an acre. You know, I can say that, but we'd have to kind of measure exactly the density. But it's going to be slightly less. Any questions? Anything? All right, well, thank you guys.
Thank you, Jess Lay. We're going to have a 15-minute break, and we'll be back here in this room for another session. Thank you.